Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to try to explain how to analyze chess games. That's a question I've been getting a lot both here in the comments section and on Patreon and on Lichess and via email, and I think it's a common problem most players have, most players of the digital era that is, and if this sounds familiar, you probably have the same problem. So you finish a game, come back from a tournament game or play a game online, whatever, you input the moves into Lichess or into ChessBase, chess.com, it doesn't matter. Then you quickly go through the opening without even looking at it. You get to the first position you remember from playing the game, in which you think you made a mistake, or you could have played a better move, or you could have won the game, whatever. So that's most probably about 20 moves deep into the game. You get to that position, turn on the engine, you look at the position and you say, oh, I could have won with knight c3, oh, this was a mistake, oh, here I could have won a rook or whatever. And then you are either happy because you found the correct move, or you are unhappy because you didn't find it. Then you browse through the other moves in 20 seconds, finish your analysis and play the next game. And most people do that on lower levels. Unfortunately, that sort of analysis prevents you from understanding your game, from understanding your mistakes, from understanding what you did well, from understanding what you have to improve, and most importantly, from understanding where your mistakes are and how to correct them. So I would like to talk about analyzing the game without the engine, completely without the engine, because the most important thing in chess, while playing tournaments, while playing longer games, is being able to think for yourself and being able to understand the subtle intricacies of each position without relying on exact engine lines or theoretical variations or lines of moves which you don't really understand but have memorized and will use in the game because you have prepared that. Okay, I will also post one example analysis of a game on Patreon. You can download it off the Patreon wall to show you how I analyze games, to give you a clear example of each move I've analyzed. And it's going to be a long analysis, but I'm going to try to explain each step of the way. So head over to Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. You can find the analysis example I did today over there. Okay, so the first thing, the way you analyze games is going to depend on your level and on your knowledge of the opening and your knowledge of the middle game principles and your knowledge of the end game. The lower your level is, the lower your understanding is, your analysis is going to have to be more detailed, more thorough, and it's going to last longer. I think that makes sense. I have divided this video into three pieces: openings, middle games, and end games, because those three stages of the game call for three completely different approaches to your analysis, in my opinion. Now, I have tried to find resources on game analysis a year or two ago, and I looked at a couple of books. One book that I would like to recommend is Timmons' Art of Chess Analysis, but he doesn't go over the theory or the ways to analyze, unfortunately. He gives a lot of games he had analyzed from the 70s, during the 70s mostly, and his analyses were published in a Dutch magazine and republished as books later on. So the analysis is really good. Unfortunately, it was done in an era without the engines, so there are mistakes, but luckily it was done in the era without the engine, so he would spend, at least he writes that in his book, about 40 hours for one game, and you can see his thinking process, which is really instructive. So I would recommend Timmons' Art of Chess Analysis. I unfortunately was not able to find a book which is going to teach you how to analyze games, except from examples. So all the ideas that you are going to hear, and this is a disclaimer, are mine, and they may be, and probably some of them are incorrect, so I would like to hear your opinion on this. Okay. Firstly, in the opening, depending on your level and your understanding of the opening, you are going to have to focus on understanding each and every move. So let me start by giving you an example game. So e4 by white, and black plays the Caro-Kann. I have chosen the Caro-Kann because it's my favorite opening. Now, if you are unfamiliar with the opening, you need to understand e4 and c6. Now, one more thing. There's a difference between analyzing your own games and analyzing other players' games, grandmaster games. My advice would be, that you analyze your own games really thoroughly the way that I'm going to show you, and then that you take Grandmaster games similar to your own games, to the openings that you play, and analyze them the same way. So if you play the Karo-Kan, then let's say this is one of your games, then you need to find example games in the same opening, in the same variation. You can do that by going over to chessgames.com. You can just Google Karo-Kan advanced variation chessgames.com. You can find example games. You can also head over to Lichess, press the small book icon next to the moves list, and you can find example games from the exact position below. You can also use a software such as ChessBase, which has huge game databases, and you can just click reference and you can find 1,000 games from the same position. The point is, if you play a certain opening, if you analyze one of your games in the opening, then the best thing is to use reference games to analyze games from the same position. That is going to reinforce your knowledge. Now, let's assume that you don't understand the opening that you play, because up to a point nobody understands the opening that they play. At a certain depth you get lost. So whether you're 1100, 1500, 2000 or 2500, at a certain depth you are not going to understand the opening that you play. So this rule is in a sense applicable to all levels, but the lower you are, the sooner you have to start applying it. Okay, so if I just started playing the Karo-Kan and I looked at Wikipedia and saw that the response to e4 is c6, that's called the Karo-Kan. I'm playing my first game and I need to understand it after the game. So I will go e4. What does that move do? Well, e4 controls the f5 square and the d5 square. White is trying to control the center. With this move, he's stopping me from playing d5 comfortably. He's stopping me from playing f5 comfortably. Perhaps white is going to play d4 and expand further in the center. I've read in one book that controlling the center is good in classical chess, so perhaps if white manages to play d4, he's going to control a lot of central squares. So that's what e4 does. It also opens up the f1 bishop. Now the bishop can go to e2, d3, c4, b5 and a6, and it opens up the queen on d1. The queen can go to e2, f3, g4 and h5, and e4 looks like a really useful move. Now c6, why did I play c6? What's the point? c6 only opens up my queen. It can go to c7, b6, a5, and perhaps, and that's what I read on Wikipedia, it prepares the move d5. Now, why do I need to prepare the move d5? Well, and I've seen that on Wikipedia as well, if I play d5 immediately, white can capture, and I'm going to have to recapture with my queen, and then white is going to be able to develop his knight and just chase my queen away. So my move c6 is preparing the d5 push without white being able to take and me having to recapture with the queen. And now I'm just giving you the most basic idea of how I try to understand the opening moves. Now, if you are playing an opening you've never played, you are going to have to do that from move 1. If you are a bit more experienced, and all of you are, then this was an extreme example, and let's move on. So, d4, d5, e5, the advanced variation of the Karo-Kan. If I've never played the variation before, what does this move do? Well, it stops black from ever pushing e5, that much is clear, since the white pawn is on e5 now. It also makes more room for the white pieces. It now means that the bishop on d3 is going to have a lot of influence on black's king side. It gains space. If you divide the board in two, in between the 4th and the 5th rank, you can see that the white pawn is now advanced into black's territory. If you divide the board in two, let's say this being white's territory and this being black's territory, white is now in black's territory and he has more space. So the advanced variation gains space for white. And that's how you go on. Bishop f5. Why did black play bishop f5? He wants to play e6 to stop e6 from white, to open up his dark squared bishop on f1. And to do that, he first wants to avoid having a bad bishop on c8. That's why he plays bishop f5 first, so that e6 later wouldn't ham in his bishop on c8. Otherwise, he would have a French defense bishop. Knight c3. What's the move knight c3 about? And you go on from there. So you basically want to force yourself to understand every single move in the opening. And when I started analyzing games, it took me 10 minutes to analyze one game. Now it takes me about 3 or 4 hours. So you learn how to analyze games properly, and I'm sure that in about a year or two it's going to take me even longer, and then perhaps I'm going to get to the top of this graph and it's going to take less and less time as I improve. The point is, it should take long to analyze a game. It should take long to try and understand every move in the opening. If you don't, then you don't understand the opening that you play. And if you do, that means that if your opponent deviates and you understand the move bishop f5, you understand the move knight c3, and your opponent, let's say you are playing white here, your opponent doesn't play e6 here, he plays something ridiculous like I don't know, knight a6. Now you immediately know that perhaps e6 is a move. Perhaps, I don't know, you might have a better idea of how to punish your opponent for not playing the most logical move in this position. Okay, and what I do to try and understand my openings, and now it usually happens after move 7 or 10, when my opponents start deviating, I will write a short report on each move. And if I know a move if I see a move I don't understand, let's move on a bit. Let's say here, knight g2 e2, and in this position the most common move is c5. Anatoly Karpov has played the move knight e7 against Kasparov, and I remember analyzing this game. So the move knight e7, the first thing you have to ask yourself, what does your knowledge base tell you? Why is c5 the main move? And if you didn't analyze the game properly, if you only knew that, well, yeah, c5 is the move here, it has to be played, then you are not going to know what to do against knight e7. Now, the reason why c5 is played is that white is going to expand with h4 and then after that with h5, and black needs to have counterplay in the center. That's why c5 is played. Black wants to weaken white's center, the d4 square, and strike in the center. Now, the move knight e7 is different, and you have to figure out what the difference is. Another good example is after knight g2 e2 c5 h4. The main move by far is h5. It leads to a line which loses a pawn. After knight f4, the bishop retreats, and the knight recaptures on h5. Now you might ask yourself, why does black give up a pawn and allow this attack on g7? This now means that if you develop your bishop, white has the option of capturing on g7. And the thing no players ask themselves on lower levels, which I found when discussing these positions, is why after h6, why doesn't black just play h6? Why after h4 black doesn't play h6? In which case, after knight f4, you can still retreat your bishop to h7, and the white knight cannot capture on h4. It can get to h4, but it doesn't win a pawn. Now, why in the world isn't h6 a more popular move? And when analyzing your games, you need to do that as well. Think about your candidate moves, think about the theoretical moves, and think about the reasons behind them. After h4, why isn't h6 more popular? Another good example is, if you know the main line of the Caro-Kann, so e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, takes, bishop f5, knight g3, bishop to g6. Now, the main move is h4. After h4, what's white threatening? White is threatening to play the move h5 and trap the bishop, because the bishop doesn't have any more squares. And you may know that h6 is the move. h6 is the main move. Now, why in the world isn't h5 a good move? And for now it's defended by the bishop and by the queen. And if you look into databases, h6 has been played 9,000 times, h5 has been played 5 times or 6 times, so there must be a reason for that. And I would advise, and now I'm just taking Caro-Kann as an example, I would advise all Caro-Kann players to understand why h5 is a bad move, because if you don't understand why h5 is bad, you will not understand why h6 is good or why h6 is the best move. And this is what you have to do in the opening. Understand every move, make sure you understand every move. If you have an idea of another move in that position, and you know for a fact that h6 is theory here, and you might want to play h5, and you don't play it because you know it's bad, but you don't know why it's bad, during your analysis, when you analyze the game, analyze h5. Analyze it without the engine, take 3 days if you have to, write a small report on it. You can look at the games in which h5 was played and try to figure out how it was punished, if it was punished. If it wasn't punished, then try to reach a conclusion on why the theory says it's a bad move. Okay, then let's move on from the opening. The middle game is far more complex. In the middle game, analysis is going to be much harder, because there are no strict rules to follow, there is no theory, and there is no prior knowledge base you can draw your conclusions from after a certain point. Now, of course, if you always play the same opening, you are going to play similar pawn structures, you are going to have similar middle game plans, and you're going to have similar piece placement, attacking plans, and stuff like that. If you play the French, then you are always going to go for c5, f6, kingside attack, and stuff like that. You're going to have problems with your c8 bishop, and this is going to be a common theme. So there is, to a certain extent, going to be similarity between the games, and you are going to have prior patterns to draw your conclusions from, but it's going to be far less often than in the opening. So in the middle game, I've broken down the factors you need to consider during your analysis. Now, first, the pawn structure. Let's just take an example middle game. Okay, let's say here. Okay, let's say you are on this move. Now, the things I think should be considered at every point. Well, firstly, I'm not even going to mention tactical threats and checkmate threats and the stuff that would immediately end the game. That always has to be considered. And if you have been following the game from move 1 up to this point, then you are going to be aware of them most of the time. Now, things that you might have missed during your game are the things that you need to figure out during your analysis. And that's why I've listed things that should be considered during your analysis, which is in turn going to make you more likely to consider them properly during the actual game, which is in turn going to make you a better player. Because if you can consider all of the things listed here, then you are going to be a grandmaster. Of course, our brain has a limited capacity. Our brains tend to get slow if we don't practice, and with practice and with constantly doing the analysis properly, you are going to get better at playing actual games. So the first thing is pawns, pawn structure, pawn breaks, passed pawns. These three things have to be taken in consideration all the time. Not just the things that have happened on the board, but the potential for them. So in this position, for example, when playing the game and when analyzing the game, I would always take into consideration the fact that black has a 4-3 pawn majority here on the queen side, and white has a 3-2 pawn majority on the king side. That means that there's a potential for a passed pawn on both sides. And now you need to take a mental note of that and move on. Pawn breaks. Are there any pawn breaks? Well, for example, black can play the move g6, breaking open this bind the h4 pawn has produced. So that's one pawn break. And stuff like that needs to be considered all the time. Pawn structure. What's the pawn structure like? What could I have done during the game? What should I do here? How do I analyze my move based on pawn structure? You basically want to take each one of these factors into consideration when analyzing the game to try and adjust your thinking to the factor. So if you were trying to analyze this position only from the perspective of pawn structure, what would you think about? How would you think? Now, after the pawns, then piece placement and piece exchanges, imbalances, and loose pieces come to mind. One thing that needs to be factored in during every game are loose pieces, because they lead to tactical trouble, they lead to tactical opportunities. For example, in this position, the e5 knight is loose. So, if you can find a double attack or an attack on the knight, which is a forcing move, which might force white to react, you will either gain a tempo by forcing white to retreat or defend, or you are going to win the knight if it's the double attack or a pawn or whatever else. So loose pieces have to be considered. Piece exchanges have to be considered during the game, and especially during analysis. Now, I'm not talking about single moves. When you are analyzing your move from this position, in this position black played the move rook f8. Now, we can understand why, because the f7 pawn is hanging, but you should always try to consider piece exchanges during your analysis, because that's going to lead to development of long-term plans and better understanding of the position, and it's going to be easier to analyze the further moves if you have the wanted exchange in your mind. So I'm just taking this as an example. That's not true for this position necessarily. I've just opened it up on Lichess. So in this position you conclude, well, my bishop is worse than white's knight, I want to trade it off. So that's your conclusion based on something. And then when analyzing the further moves, you can conclude, well, this was a good plan, trading my bishop for his knight. Why didn't I consider this candidate? Was there a good move which involved trading my bishop for his knight, or a plan trying to trade my bishop for his knight? After that, while playing the game and while analyzing, open files, open diagonals, and all open lines have to be considered vertically, horizontally, diagonally, because they lead to piece activity. Open diagonals are crucial for bishops. Open files and lines are critical for rook placement and rook activity. So when analyzing your move, let's say you made a rook move here. The f7 pawn was defended. When analyzing the possibilities for that move and possibilities for other rook moves and the potential for your rook, all open lines have to be factored in. Where would you like your rook to be? In this case, I would love to have my c8 rook on d2. That much is clear. If my rook was on d2, my rook would be much better. Let's say your rook is on f7, your e rook is on f7, your c rook is on d2. I would say that black is better. Let's say your queen is on a5, also defending the rook. So open files, open diagonals need to be considered. After that, outposts and weak squares, which you always, at least subconsciously, consider during the game, have to be scrutinized in your analysis, because those are the things that I at least miss most often. You're going to miss chances based on the fact that you missed that the square was weak, that the square was a potential outpost. This position is not that rich in outposts, I have to admit. But let's imagine, let's just defend this pawn and let's create a weakness. Let's say white plays a stupid move here, f3. Now in this case, this is an outpost, and the bishop is not such a useful move to exploit this outpost, but let's say this happens. This is now a good bishop, which can only be attacked by a rook. It cannot be attacked by a pawn, etc., etc. So each weak square, each outpost has to be considered in your analysis, because you might have profited from the fact having noticed the outpost during the game. Okay, targets related to loose pieces, but applicable to pawns as well. Every single piece that is loose is immediately a potential target. Every piece or pawn that can be attacked once, twice, 3 times, it doesn't matter, is a potential target. If you can attack something, it's a target. In your mind, what you need to assess then is, could I have attacked this pawn? Let's say the a2 pawn is a target for the moment, and it's a target, is defended by the king, attacked by the queen. In this position, black played, for example, the stupid move bishop g3. But since a2 was a potential target, could black have played rook c4, rook c5, rook a5, and put some more pressure on the a2 pawn? That would be one idea, that would be one plan. Okay, and then with every single move in the middle game that you have played, you need to understand why you played it. I would advise you to take each move and write a small report on it. Once again, considering all of these factors. Was any of these or all of these factors considered in your thinking process? I would advise you to come up with, why did you choose that candidate move? And this applies to the analysis of your games. Why did you choose that for a candidate moves? What other candidate moves did you choose? How deeply did you calculate your move? And why you've decided to play that move instead of all of the other candidates. And in hindsight, were the other candidates better? Then during your analysis, I would advise you to calculate all the candidate moves once again and come to a conclusion whether you've chosen the correct one, the correct move among your candidates. And then thirdly, find the candidate moves you've missed. There are always going to be some in complicated middle game positions. Okay, after you've done that, I would advise you to look at reference games. Once again, it's going to be harder in the middle game and it's going to take way more time. But for example, this is a Caro-Kann, the advanced Caro-Kann. The advanced Caro-Kann. Find games in the advanced Caro-Kann, and what you want to look for is a similar pawn structure. You want to look for a similar pawn structure and similar piece balance. So for example, in this case, I would look for a pawn structure with 3-2 on the king side for white, 4-3 on the queen side for black, 2 rooks and the queen each, and 1 minor piece each. And I would try to look at that game from the beginning to the end, try to see what the grandmaster has done with his piece, with his minor piece, where did the grandmaster put his rooks, why is my rook on f8 defending f7, why is my other rook on c8, is the grandmaster putting his rooks on d8 and e8 for some reason? Is he putting his rooks on b8 and trying to push b5? With reference games, you are going to understand which plans you got wrong much better. And you are going to get an idea for many more candidate moves for the games to come. And finally, in the end game, your analysis needs to be exact. That's why for the endgame I would advise you to use books. I recommend Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. You can use any endgame book. The point is, open the chapter with the endgame you had in the game. Let's try to see whether this game had an ending, an endgame. Okay, no, not really. Let's try to find a different one. Let's try to find some endgame. Was this the same one? I managed to open the same game. Okay. Yeah, not really an endgame. Okay, I'm not going to waste time looking for endgames. We can use this as an example as well. So this game ended in a draw here, but let's say the bishops get traded off. So you have an endgame with 2 rooks each and the complicated pawn structure, 7 pawns each. So we want to look for the chapter in Dvoretsky or in any other opening book where there is an endgame with a complicated 2 rook position with multiple pawns. Now what you do there, the first thing, list and remember the rules said in the book if there are any. Dvoretsky usually does give a lot of rules, so that can be useful. So list the rules, remember the rules. Go through the endgame. The first draft is going through the endgame and see whether any of the rules are applicable. In most endgames, the rules are not going to be exact and there are going to be no applicable rules. But if there are any, try to think about them in reference to your own moves, in reference to the position. Try to figure out whether you knew the rules or thought about the rules during the game, and then make sure you have listed and remember them for the games to come. Now the next thing you have to do, the end game should be calculated indefinitely until the end. Okay, that's hard for complicated endgames with rooks, so you are going to view it more as a middle game than as an end game, but as soon as in your analysis the rooks get traded off, or during the game the rooks get traded off and all the pieces get traded off and you get into a pawn ending, this is, in my opinion, the hardest part of the analysis of any game, because you need to be exact and go all the way. So take a day, take 2 hours, take a week, it doesn't matter how long it takes you. Take a notebook and write down the analysis, but you need to make sure to get through all the variations and get through to the end. And the question you want answered is, does white win? Does black win? Is it a draw? As soon as you can say that with absolute 100% certainty, you are done. And that's your endgame analysis. So, to wrap up, to conclude, I think that you should be analyzing your games really thoroughly. You should also be analyzing Grandmaster games, because that's one of the best ways to study chess. The best thing would be, if you are studying a certain opening repertoire, if you have certain openings, analyze the games in those openings. You're going to have thematic openings, of course. You are going to have thematic middle games with thematic pawn structures, piece placements, attacking plans, defensive problems, and you are going to have thematic endgame structures. In many openings, for example in the Grunfeld, white often has a passed d5 pawn. That's a fact. And if you play the Grunfeld and analyze Grunfeld games, in a while you are going to learn how to behave around the passed d5 pawn in the middle game, how to behave around the passed d5 pawn in the end game. And in a while, after analyzing a lot of games, you are going to become much stronger in understanding, playing against, and anticipating your opponent's moves, which is the main thing which is going to make you better at chess. Okay, once again, I'm going to attach one game analysis of my own on the Patreon feed today. You can download it from Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. And let me know what you think about my theory on how to analyze games. I would really like to hear your input. Let me know if you do anything differently. Let me know if anything I do is a mistake. I would love to improve my process. Once again, this is my process. This is not something I've learned from books. I have taken advice from example game analysis from grandmasters and tried to formulate my own rules from them, but I've never read a book which deals only with how to analyze chess games. I've only seen examples. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hope you liked the video, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.